All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our strategy game design roundtable discussion, where we'll be talking about topics relating specifically to strategy design and strategy gameplay. For this month's topic, sadly, Theresa couldn't make it. She is in the middle of development, but we have a backup lined up tonight. So I'll give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. So we'll go in kind of clockwise order. So for myself, I'm of course Josh Blaser from Game Wisdom, where I talk some more about game design and game development. I have multiple books on game design out now, and apparently I'll be working on at least 4 more in the coming months and so. But I'll throw over to Tomo.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tomo Moriwaki. I've been a game designer for now, I think, actually 25 years. I was saying 25 years last year, but it might have been 24. And my claim to fame is creative director from the Spider-Man 2 title in 2004, and currently I'm design director of a small development studio called Hyperkinetic Studios. And we have a game called Epic Tavern that's on Steam Early Access presently.
All right, and down to Gellert.
Hello, my name is Gellert Keresztes. I'm an entrepreneur, founder, and a game developer of 16 years. Also work as a consultant at Valde. Work a lot with game development. Have a studio for about 10 years now called Strategy Mill. And we have a game out called Terminal Conflict, which you can buy off of Steam. I also work in consultancy, work a lot with digital leadership. I look forward to getting your questions, and if there are any elements, just please write us in the chat. And I throw the ball over to Seth.
Hey, I'm Seth Goldberg, also known as, well, I run the Strategy Informer. It's got multiple people on it now, so I guess I'm not known as. I've kind of been passionate about AI for, just about all my life. About 16 years of game development. About 27 years of the tech industry. That's pretty much it. I do indeed work also with Gellert, so just want to put that up front. And I'll pass it to, I guess we're done. I'm not passing it anywhere. I go for the touchdown.
And Draken chat want to know, did you say 16 or 60 years in the development?
Yes, definitely 60 years. I look a little bit young for my age. 16, yes. 16 years.
There you go. Hey, David, how are you doing? All right. But yeah, the last one of these we did, or for the Strategy Roundtable, we did that recorded, but now that we have a template set up, and hopefully my internet stays stable, we'll be able to do these live. And I'm hoping if things open up for Theresa, we'll get her back on for next time, but we'll see where things go. But yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and it definitely relates, I think, outside of game development as well, or outside of strategy games, I should say, in terms of AI design. And like we said, this is kind of what we were, kind of a follow-up to what we were talking about last month, with the idea of building challenging strategy games, or building games that people want to play. And one of the things that we talked about last month was this idea that for a lot of people, for the mainstream, they're not really interested in, super hard challenges. They don't want to fight a grandmaster AI, or, the AI that's going to do everything perfectly. But for our topic this time, we're talking about trying to make AI a little bit more human-like, to make it more as a viable competitor, as opposed to just either being, deterministic or super Skynet AI, as my thumbnail demonstrates. That's a very tricky topic. So I'm going to open up to whoever wants to start first in terms of where do you think AI should go in terms of, being a worthy opponent in a video game?
I can start, actually. So let me start with painting the picture. So Garry Kasparov sits down and plays chess against Deep Blue. And in this famous showdown between humankind and computers, right? And what ends up happening, and Nate Silver writes about this in his book, is that all of a sudden, Deep Blue makes a totally unexpected move. Totally unexpected. And it's the 44th move. You guys can check it out. It's he easily won the game, but he was so fazed by this move. He was completely spooked, and it influenced all of his games coming after that. And he was saying that this AI was an alien, had a mind of its own. It turns out that what actually happened was that there was a bug, and it just defaulted to making any legal move. That was the move the AI made. Now, that flaw, that failure, led Kasparov to believe that this AI was superhuman. And this says something about AI. So computers are built to be perfect machines. They should not err. But human beings, we come from a different development cycle. We develop through evolution, which builds on flaw, on failure. So we come from two different perspectives, right? One comes from a natural process of evolution, whilst the other one comes from one of a clockwork machinery. And really your question here is, how can we unite these two worlds that seemingly are so divided between the setup of one of a perfect machine, of an all-calculating, all-knowing element, and one that thrives on failure? And because that's what leads our evolution, right? So how can we unite these elements? And I think it's about looking at how can we build in processes when they fail in a computer that they actually lead to success. What do you guys think about this?
So it would need to go into multiple layers. You would have the strategy layer that was talking to a layer that personalized each AI. And in its simplest system, it could look like something that Civ has brought in, where each of the leaders have their own preferences to what's going on. So you would have that system talking to a secondary system that did the gameplay and said, okay, I need to make a set of moves that accomplish this goal, which would be based on what the preferences were for the leader or for the opponent. And then possibly a learning neural network to figure out what's going on. And that's a very expensive answer. You're talking about, a neural network that's actually running on the system. That's tough to do with what we discussed last time, where the neural net was designed, it trained the AI, and then the trained AI is what's on the computer playing against you.
It's interesting. Right now we think of the AIs that we're building, right, as this sort of perfect, highly optimized, always choosing the best answer, and sort of repetitive and sort of mechanical in our estimation of it or our vision of it. But I think that's just because that's what we've been optimizing them for, right? The deep learning algorithms have been moving towards that because that's obviously a first step that we want to achieve before we get to the next step, which you can kind of think of almost like everything that humankind does as trying to make it like us, to feel right like us. And so all we got to do is start training it on material to give it human-like qualities, and I think we could theoretically get there. Now that's me talking about what the future is like, but in the short term,
you mean like brute forcing them.
Yeah, brute forcing human nature.
Yeah.
But for now, we're left with like trying to make design decisions to just warm up the responsiveness of the computer or the AI or the machine. And on my end, like with stuff I do, like with Epic Tavern, it's almost always faking it. It's always trying to add in a feature that appears to be like a flaw so that it just is kind of, you can have a nicer relationship with your single player experience.
But fuzzy isn't exactly the answer. If you go fuzzy and just throw in a flaw, then it's almost, you might as well go random at that point.
But that doesn't work because random flaws aren't human flaws, right? Human flaws are in a certain sort of category of vibe.
Yeah, can you imagine playing Civilization, right? And it had random outcomes. People would say this game is flawed, this game is bugged, it doesn't work as intended if it just had random outcomes on every battle. But also, curiously, if you made every battle be the percentages that you see initially on the screen and not have weighted percentages, people will also think it's flawed. Because theoretically, you can have a 50-50% chance and lose 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times in a row, right?
You just described like every time I play a strategy game on stream there, Gellert. Especially like Darkest Dungeon or XCOM.
And then where's my quick save? Where's my quick save? This roll of the die has just been terrible to me. Yeah.
Didn't Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead start with them flipping pennies 100 times and coming out heads?
Great movie, by the way.
Yeah, brilliant.
So, one thing that I think I want to touch on what Gellert said a few minutes ago about the Kasparov, I forget, Deep Blue or Big Blues having the bug, or the idea of having an AI that can make mistakes. And I think that's a very interesting point, because again, like as we said before, like when we look at most video games, either like we're talking about like patterns for AI, is either something that is deterministic, that it will do the same thing every time, or it could be a very basic random pattern that the AI will make a decision from a specific pool of events, repeat that as we see in games like the Souls-likes and so on. But the idea of having an AI that can purposely, or I guess quote-unquote purposely, have mistakes to it, that it can screw up, and not because of a bug or because the AI wasn't programmed right, but because it was programmed to have those mistakes, is something that's a very interesting aspect, especially again when we talk about strategy games. And there are plenty of strategy games out there that, again, you either have the AI that is so, I guess, brain dead that it doesn't know how to play, or it plays so well that, you either have to cheat the game yourself, or you just can't beat it. And we see again what the market is looking for in terms of these kinds of challenges.
But you don't know a funny part of this. I've looked at this a lot with our engineers, and in fact, we discovered that there's an issue there as well, because many of the people who became engineers in the first place are perfectionists. They want to create the perfect systems. So the people you need to introduce these elements into the algorithms are not going to be necessarily the same type of people and engineers.
We need a whole new crop of engineers.
And a whole new crop of engineers, yeah.
That are dramatists.
Yeah. So one of those elements is like, for example, you look at AI that looks at facial expressions or body language. That's more theater than it is necessarily something else. It's quite fantastic how that can be designed, because cultural context matters. There's no one human fits all element here, right? It's subjective. What is human is subjective, and it's cultural. So it's sort of, if we're going to bake that into an AI, how do you do that? Because body language is subjective. It's going to be different, and it has cultural contexts. So it's very difficult of a challenge. What do you guys think about? Like, how can that be achieved?
I am definitely not a programmer, so that's definitely like way above my own pay grade. But anything for Tomo or Seth?
Well, I'd say one of the essential strategies is to loosen up the concept of what our success criteria is, and or expand it. we're either in the middle of going postmodern, or we're already there, where the kind of conventions of winning and losing, that's yesterday's news, right? Now there's so much rich nuance to the possible experiences we put together. We just have to start building towards those kind of futuristic success criteria. And once we start mastering that, I think we can start getting a lot of really convincing results. I'm not saying that we'll have an AI that really truly behaves like a person, but sort of in direct contradiction to, if we can't make AI perfect, then we shouldn't even try. It's literally, if we try, we're going to eventually get something slightly better, and that'll lead to something better and something better and something better.
Yeah, but maybe it's also Seth and I have talked about this, and I want to throw the ball to you, Seth, with this as well, because we talked about maybe the concept is about changing this idea. What you mentioned, Tomo, was changing this idea about winning. That instead of having finite games, we should look at building AIs that are good at infinite games, and where they maximize their resources just to stay in the game, because that's a completely different mindset. And we talked about this with relation to the Vietnam War and sort of the different strategies used by the VC and the Americans when they looked at how to strategize in the Vietnam War. And Seth, you were talking about that before. The sort of context of Quagmire and sort of building these elements in, looking at sort of the infinite game.
One of the things that I thought was brilliant in game design was in Civ 5, when the AIs tried to win. They weren't just there as roadblocks. They had a goal, they picked a strategy, and they kind of stuck with it. Now, they weren't perfect. They were very exploitative. And, you know, in any strategy game, there are those people that will go for the exploits. They will try to play as efficiently as possible so that they could beat deity. And that's the way they want to play, and that's great. So those AIs were exploitable. Now, if you look at a counterinsurgency situation, there's no way that the Viet Cong could fight the American troops head-to-head. So they had to do hit-and-run tactics. Now, they were looking to inflict enough casualties to cause the U.S. to pull out, which they were successful in a way. Well, no, I would say they were completely successful. Now, if you translate that to a game, it gets, I'm still trying to think in terms of civilization. I should really break that from my thinking and try to expand a little further into what a turn-based strategy is.
Yes, because you were mentioning this, that the Viet Cong adapted constantly to what the U.S. was doing. So that's where we have this bridge from, like, when an AI plays an infinite game, it has to have the ability to be able to adapt, to realize first, identify this is the situation, and then adapt to that particular situation. So we're not building so much robots; we're building characters in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. They have to constantly reevaluate the situation, look at the board, and go, okay, this is not working. I need to back out of this. I'm about to be encircled. I need to switch position. They're moving in this formation. We need to hit them. And some games do that really well, but it's still based on heuristic. If you look at Flashpoint, Red Storm Flashpoint, it's constantly reevaluating and constantly trying to duplicate. At least I've never played the Soviets in it, but it seems to be trying to duplicate Warsaw Pact doctrine really, really well. And, that's swarm tactics. But it's able to adapt and say, okay, this area is cut off. I'm going to stop throwing troops into this meat grinder and go the other way, which is kind of unique for a strategy gaming AI.
And so true. Those games get so fixated on optimizing the unit-to-unit interactions that the larger strategies just disappear.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Josh? Sorry.
What I wanted to kind of piggyback on what I think Gellert just said about trying to build characters as opposed to AI opponents. And like this reminds me of again, like we're all kind of stuck in civilization mode here. But again, it reminds me of having the different, obviously the different leaders and having that represented. And one of the challenges, again, I think, is like trying to grow that beyond just saying, this is your pacifist, this is your warmonger. And we all have seen, the jokes about, Gandhi becoming the nuclear missile despot in some of the older civilization games.
No, it's
Hey,
still
that's
happens.
deterrence, ultimate deterrence.
No, I think building personalities into the AI is brilliant. I think that certainly should be done. Humankind said that was going to be the case. Humankind didn't live up to its promises so far. I think that'll change in a few years, especially with Sony backing the game.
Nice. I still need to play that one. A point that Chris brought up a few minutes ago that I wanted to touch on, the idea of perceived random. And I think that's another major point when it comes to this idea of humanizing AI. Like we said, when it comes to a lot of strategy games, it is either, or, like the tactics the AI can use, is sometimes very deterministic, that you'll know every time the AI will go over here. They will use Fireball. Or you go for something, again, where you have that sense of RNG. And one of the things I wrote about in the Deep Dive Roguelikes was the idea that randomness is quote-unquote fair. That it doesn't care about emotion, it doesn't care, if you got 20 perfect hits in a row or 20 misses. But like we said, when we bring the human factor into it, that's a different point. Because again, how many people watching this have played a game like XCOM or Darkest Dungeon, where it says 80% chance to hit, and you miss the next 5 hits in a row, and the enemy kills you, and then you will go and break your keyboard or throw your desktop out the window.
Yeah, I could never play Iron Man XCOM. I'd kill myself.
So a non-AI related feature I think that can improve this particular RNGesus problem is to give the player love when they get a bad streak. That means you're looking out for bad streaks. And try to sort of minimize the negative impact of the bad streak. And when you get a streak of positives, to celebrate it loud. It's purely just, it's just a pat on the back, but I think it can help that situation.
Axis and allies.
I think, Tomo, what you're saying here, and in a bigger context, is understand the end user, right? Understand what the end user wants. And in that, when we work with looking at AIs, we try to map like what is an acceptable range of behavior for the end users playing this. What is an expected outcome? Because as you say, if you lose 8 battles in a row for RNG purposes, you're just gonna go, what the. Why am I not just rolling a die then, right? Why am I playing this game?
Yep.
And so it comes down to like understanding the user and seeing what is an acceptable range of outcomes here. And because you are sort of preempting the element. But I think more importantly, and for game designers, is play your own game. But play it from the mindset of the end user. Is this acceptable that when we play the game that I lose 8 times in a row? And if not, how can that be changed?
Yeah, and I think another factor, and this is something that we were talking about last time, is what are the tactics available? Like, what are the tools that both sides get access to? Because obviously, the more complicated it takes to play the game, the harder it's going to be to create an AI or, train it in order to make use of those tools. And this is why we see for a lot of games, it either goes the deterministic route, or it's essentially 2 distinct games, that the player has their own rules and abilities, the AI has their own rules and abilities, and never the two shall meet. And it's like, as we were saying, like in terms of what people are looking for, I think, like we said, like having an AI that can play the game just as well as a human and make every move as optimal, most people will probably not enjoy it. Again, like for our audience here, for the people on the panel, we would love to play against an AI that can match us, pound for pound in terms of our moves. But again, the greater question, and I'm going to throw this as well to the chat watching since we have it this time, is would you like to play a game or a strategy or tactical game that the AI is on par for, like in terms of a human player, in terms of adapting and challenging you?
So I went to Reddit with our strategy cast, and I was very excited about it, and I got a lot of people talking about it. And a lot of the feedback that I got was nobody plays a chess AI anymore that's perfect. It doesn't happen. No one wants to lose. You're not going to beat a grandmaster. That's the end of it. Now, Dominion, as we talked about last time, uses a neural network to train the AI to play against you. And the way it does that with the strategizing, it goes, okay, is there a card here that allows me to set up an engine? If I'm going to be able to set up that engine, I'm going to pick up on that card a great deal. Is there a card here that allows me to stockpile gold, which then I could put into problems? So it's at a very high level. It's not really making a decision of what exact card to play. It's making more of a decision of how to accomplish a certain goal. Build an engine, acquire gold, get provenance. And it tries to optimize that situation. It's not playing... Dominion is kind of almost a solitaire game. There's very little player interaction. Now, when we're looking at a turn-based or a 4-ax, there's a lot of player interaction that's going on. You're constantly countering moves one way or the other, countering builds. Now, if you look at StarCraft, how it does it, it's constantly it's DeepMind. It's constantly evaluating the build order, and it's doing a counter order to that. It's constantly evaluating where your scouts are, and it's moving the other way. It's that AI you speak of that's doing the counterbalance. But Firaxis is not going to have the resources to make a deep mine. And our computers aren't going to run it. Granted, they're getting close, but, there's still the cost factor. So I think we're still in that blue sky region of having something capable of truly countering every step.
That's very interesting that you say that. Yeah.
What?
That's very interesting that you say that, Seth. Yeah.
I was going to say, that once we have that gives us sort of as we approach that point, that gives us kind of a maximum difficulty opportunity, right? We can increase the difficulty and kind of challenge ever more kind of skillful players. But in the lead up to that, to kind of accomplish the goal that we're sort of discussing around humanizing the AI, I think something that gets overlooked in the conversation quite a bit is what kind of games work, right? If it's checkers or chess, those are sort of like chess is sort of like a several orders of magnitude more complicated version of chess, in checkers in some ways. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of deterministic, right? The computer knows all the information that you know, and it can basically if it can do a sufficient number of calculations, then there's sort of no way you can sort of outsmart it unless you could think further ahead of it and force it down a set of bad decisions, which honestly, your brain's probably not ever, like at this point, your brain, or no human brain is going to be good enough to do that. But if you create an environment with enough hidden information where I could be operating and you can only see some amount of the information that represents my position, now the AI it's not playing to its greatest strengths currently, right? Which is an overwhelming processing advantage.
Yeah,
Rather, it has to make choices and it can mess up. And now like devising these environments where I could theoretically deceive you or deceive the AI into thinking I'm going to go over there for a fight, and I'm actually going to go over there for a fight and then outmaneuver it as a result. Like designing those kinds of environments, I think, is an important part in the interim period to humanizing AI.
Yep, and
I think sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, what I was going to say is, as you were saying that, Tomo, it really reminded me of Alien Isolation and what they did with the kind of director and alien AI in that game. And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, Chris, have a good night as well. Hopefully you can watch it when you wake up. But as I was saying, what they did was they had two different AI directors kind of working in tandem. You had the kind of grand overarching director AI that knows exactly where the player is and knows what they're doing, and it tells the alien, okay, they're in this area, go here and start looking around. And then you have the alien AI that's kind of the local one that, okay, I'm in this area, what am I going to do? Where am I going to start to go to look for the player? And while I really liked that concept, I still felt that it was too mechanical. Like, for those of you who remember, I was playing this on like the highest difficulty. So there were several times where the alien literally has not seen me. I have been completely hidden stealthy. I walk over to the goal for the door, it immediately turns around from a complete opposite direction and goes right at me. Like, there's literally no way we know that I was there. And I always felt like that's when we get to kind of the issues when we talk about AI. That when the player knows that it's an AI, or knows that the AI, it's not really planning. It's just being given information like, hey, I have all my tanks over here. So, send all your just so happens, send your anti-tank units to go over there. That the player starts to feel again like they're not playing the game, they're just, being beaten by somebody who just knows more information than they do.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem they tried to resolve, because AlphaZero Go is very much on a magnitude different than the chess AIs. Because in Go, you have a totally different set of problems that you need to solve. And when we look at that element, you can't just brute force Go like you can chess. So I think the elements there and that development, and for those, if you just can search for AlphaZero Go and see the algorithms, because they have published the papers as well of how they try to resolve this particular problem, these set of problems. And because to build something that's like a holistic solution, you must make the AI anticipate multiple challenges. You can't just have, and I think that mechanical element is when you have an AI that has this built in, this reaction time, and then it just reacts. But they needed to build something that anticipates multiple challenges, so it's more it's not reactive, it needs to be proactive, and that's a different set of challenges altogether.
But there's tons of input data that they could put in there to teach it and to anticipate. It's like, okay, he's going for this style of strategy, he's going for this style of play, and try to counter that. I believe Go has been solved, though. So, it's in the same.
The Grandmaster. It beat the Grandmaster in Go. So it's an absolutely brilliant AI. Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah.
Well, I think it exceeds human capability, right? But I think the neat thing about AlphaGo is that it's still playing a serious game with with AI, in that it has to exceed its capabilities. It has to make assumptions, right? It is operating against some hidden information, and it has to kind of take chances. right? In chess, it doesn't have to take chances, or at least I'm sure if we assign human feeling to the AI, it doesn't feel like it's taking chances. It's ranking options and scraping off the top. And then if we just take an environment like Go that's skewed more in favor of the human, right? That takes yet more information away and starts putting this kind of like you could create an equal footing between even an extraordinarily high processing, sophisticated AI and us meatbags, where we're on equal footing because of the available information. Because I can just simply choose left, and the AI doesn't have the tools to know that necessarily.
And you know what's kind of funny about that is, when you look at the starters the AI does, it's nothing that a human would do. Which, coincidentally, if you take those elements and you take the elements of the human player, they are together better than the AI or the human alone. So in that, there's a positive message, which is basically the point isn't to create necessarily an AI that will beat us. The point is, how can we unite with the AI to sort of become this almost alien entity?
So you're saying we need to go cyberpunk then? We just need to start combining into... There we go.
Let's all become, augment our abilities. Because then we get the best of both worlds.
So
what if we flip the script? Instead of creating an AI that will devastate us and focusing on that, what about an AI that plays just well enough to challenge us and is keeping consistent with how we're doing and how it's doing against us, and will pull back if it's losing or if it's winning, and then push again if it starts losing, to keep the player at kind of a guessing game not only, but also to keep him challenged and engaged. Because as Tomo brought up last time, the engagement and the delight, once that goes away, you don't care about the game. I'm paraphrasing that badly, but
no. I think but I think what you said is you just hit the essential core of this entire conversation, just right there.
Yeah, like imagine if you could have this is something we talked about last time with the idea of having games that have single player versus multiplayer, and a lot of the single player options you're playing you're just playing multiplayer with bots, but a lot of those times the bot is either completely useless or they'll just do everything for the player. But imagine being able to design an AI that is capable of playing the game, not exactly like, pro MLG esports player, but, like your friend Bob or Mary down the street who can play with you and can play, not perfectly, but enough that it feels like you're getting the experience without having to rely on, hoping there's still people playing this game 15, 20, 30 years down the line.
Yeah. So essentially, isn't it funny? How do you beat Skynet? You beat Skynet by getting some of the Terminators to be on your side, and then together you beat Skynet. That's the way you beat Skynet.
Nice.
Yeah.
So here's another question I want to throw to the table and to the people watching. Piggybacking again off of what Gellert was just talking about in terms of having the AI make mistakes or having faults that it can fall upon. Again, as we talked about earlier with the idea of perceived randomness, and again, how the player looks at what the AI is doing or what the AI is succeeding or failing, that do you think that when it comes to the consumer side, that we do have an AI that can make mistakes, and not just make them behind the scenes, but actually show the AI, let's say, instead of just going here and just one-shotting my archer, let's say they accidentally click over here, and let's say they're just setting a unit up and ignoring them, that for the player, I feel like there will be players who will just say, oh, this game is busted, developers stupid, they didn't, the AI was horribly designed. Like, it feels like there's still going to be that challenge of, again, getting the psychology that the AI can make mistakes, and it's not because the game was programmed incorrectly, but that's how it was programmed.
Yeah, also that what's kind of funny when we look at, for example, paradox games, many of the paradox games in essence don't have, well, of course the AI has some instructions of what to do, but many of those come from like continuous iterations of data. So basically you describe the rules of engagement for the AI, and then it sort of builds upon, like, as the game continues, the characters are built within the game, depending on a set of complex elements that kind of feels like you have personalities developing, because you impact the other characters in the game as you go. You impact a bunch of the main essences of what they are, and then they have the set of rules of, well, this is when you can engage, this is how you build an economy, this is how you do all of these different elements in the game. And it sort of comes together by continuous iteration. So sort of where you have these feedback mechanisms built in, where you impact the AI impacts you, and then you just have that feedback go loop forward, because it is incredibly engaging to see the response to what you do and how the AI tries to solve problems. But I think also, and this is something we discovered when we worked with Paradox games, and definitely something AlphaZero Go has experienced, is how people love to see AIs fight other AIs.
Yeah.
Because you get to learn so much from that.
Well, I think you said something.
You guys
really
also have this experience? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And I think there's something that you said that was really important just now about how oh God, tell me I didn't lose it. The this kind of us influencing
the continuous iteration,
AI, right? And the AI then influencing us. It's in that conversation that all this engagement is to be found, right? That to like it's our sort of fake version of imagining something else being alive is that it's responding to specifically us, right? And the moment it does that, the moment we believe that it's changed its behavior because of something specific to my choices, I have a relationship now. And now something very essentially human has been triggered and is starting to kind of flow.
And
I don't want.
I'm so. Yeah, I have a question, but yeah, I'll let you do your point first.
I don't necessarily want. How to word this? I want an AI that can challenge me. I don't necessarily need it to pass the Turing test or the Turing test. So most people don't, though. They want to win. They want to have an experience, and they want to come out ahead. I talk crap about Stellaris constantly, but turning the player into the big bad was the best thing that they could have done with that game, because that, was basically the power fantasy of every player in Stellaris, was to just dominate. So they went with that, and that was brilliant. The thing is anybody who is really wanting to be challenged doesn't play Stellaris, or they play it with the AI getting incredible bonuses, and that's not really a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Stellaris is definitely best as a game about the wonder of exploring space.
Yeah. I personally, can play Stellaris for about 3 or 4 hours, and then it gets boring.
I can play it for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then I'm completely confused and don't know what's going on.
I absolutely loved it for like 100 hours, and then once I had played out all of its machinery, I kind of couldn't play it again. But yeah. I'm kind of willing to go back because there are a lot of expansion packs that have come out since.
And I think Seth's point is a very big one, as we talked about, that when the player knows that it's an AI, when it knows that it has a set of commands and rules to it, there's usually two responses. Either you lose interest in the game, or you go, okay, how do I break this AI? How do I understand, if the AI knows that I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, if I do, L, N, and P, I can trick it and start breaking it. And we've seen, again, like, never discount gamers in terms of figuring out how to break impossible challenges. They will do it. They will data mine. They will come up with the most insane strategies. And in a lot of cases, it will work. So as a developer, never say that something is impossible, because all you're doing is just setting up rooms of people to, break your game to hell and back.
Yeah, we found that out in the MMO days. Wow, people will put at such lengths.
And I want to go to a question Chris asked, because I think it's a very interesting point. They wanted to know, is there an instance in any game where a certain unit/enemy has significantly harder/more advanced AI than everything else? Usually we talk about this in terms of boss enemies, but can anyone think of a case where you have like normal enemies and one type or one set of enemies is a little bit higher or a little bit more complicated than the others? Like, the only game that kind of popped into my mind was Fear. And of course, Fear being known for having a very engaging enemy AI for how they would use squad tactics and react to what the player was doing.
I would say any game where they added in the design element, the element of surprise, where the AI can switch between what it does. It doesn't follow the same rhythm every single time. And the players love it and hate it. Because once you figure out that, oh my God, he can play 10 different strategies here and he's not going to play them in the same order every single time, for example, in MMOs, they are the most loved and the most hated bosses, because it might just randomly just wipe the entire raid or whatever might happen. And I think it's the same in these types, in any type of game really, where you add that element of surprise. But that surprise must be one that you can counter. If you can counter it, then people will love it. If it just mindlessly kills everyone, then people will hate it. And I think building at that element of surprise already in the design phase is super important, because people look at the emotion, the experience, the venue, and the fun, but that fifth element, that element of surprise, where I think it's important to look at that, and not just the element of surprise of how can the AI surprise you, but how can you as a player surprise yourself? I think that's an important element to add in context with the AI. And that element, having it there, that creates sort of magic, where, when that happens.
Yeah.
What did you guys think?
I just thought of another example really fast from a Zero Ranger. If anyone else play that game, the shmup, the final boss of the game basically forgoes a fixed pattern in terms of its bullet hell and becomes 100% a random pattern fight. And it completely, there's no other boss like it in the game. And, ironically, it's a boss I really enjoy, but if you're a hardcore shmup Tuhu fan, it completely wrecks your entire brain, because you're not used to the AI, not doing the exact same thing or the exact same patterns.
Well, and that's the kind of game where the way you get awesome at it, right? It's like you're building a typeset for printing. You're like, no, this piece goes here, then this piece goes here, then this piece goes here, and then we run prints of it, and then I win. And if someone's mastered that behavior pattern, suddenly for there to be no pattern is devastating, right? Might have been a terrible call by that developer. Who knows?
I can't think of any strategy game where that occurs, but I think it would be interesting if you had, say, going back to the civilization model, or even like a StarCraft model, where one of the races just played significantly different than the others. I'm not talking like, gray goo. You've got the goo that has a completely different rule set. But, in this case, it would be a completely different type of intelligence that it was playing against. Not
Well, you can
necessarily.
enforce that by creating
Yeah.
different rules, right? I think you get a little bit of that in the Total War series between like Attila-like factions versus the conventional factions, or in the Total War Warhammer era, I kill everybody to be powerful, I pillage everything to become powerful, or I do the normal thing to become powerful.
Yeah, and imagine if you also built into that, you guys know the Legend of Ashoka, right? So it was this emperor who built his empire in India by conquering basically all of India and making it Buddhist. This is way back, but he murdered a lot of people, and then he had this feeling of remorse. So he vowed never to go to war again and built, highways instead, built schools, built pillars, built up this wonderful empire based on values of pacifism. And he wrote the elements that currently are part of the United Nations human rights. Yeah, he wrote down the first human rights, right? And it said that when he died, the only thing that remained of him was his father's sword and half a mango, and there's a change, when he walked on the battlefield and he saw the devastation and the killing that he had unleashed with hundreds of thousands killed on the battlefield, he felt remorse and he changed his behavior. Now, imagine putting that into an AI. The Mongols in civilization just come invade, and then all of a sudden they have this sense of remorse and start building a culture. That would be amazing to see, though, right? They start trading with you, and yeah.
That kind of happened in Civ 5, where, they would switch from a warmonger and then win a cultural victory.
And 2 points from chat that I want to touch on. Axiom of Dominion was talking about having introducing events or content packs into games like Stellaris and so on. And I think that gets at one of the challenges when you're trying to create new interesting rules and mechanics, is that you then have to train the AI to then accept those rules and mechanics. And what we often see in games that go for fixed content like that, is that if something is fixed, it's entirely deterministic. You know exactly what's going to happen every time this event shows up. XCOM from Firaxis got dinged from a lot of fans when they would release story-driven expansion packs or story-driven missions, because the story mission happens the same way every time because it's a story. It has to follow the same linear set of events. And it's something you have to be very mindful of when you're trying to introduce new elements to games like this.
Yeah, very interesting point indeed. And I think part of that is sort of prototype, and prototype. Because once you do these permutations and you see sort of what that leads to, one other aspect of this, if we talk about strategy games and tutorials, is sort of how we build up tutorials. Because in many games, you can go in an FPS game, most FPS games are sort of the same in that you can take with you a lot of what you learn from one FPS game into another FPS game. You know how you move, you know how you jump, you know how you aim, even though the guns might work differently or the economic systems might work differently. Most of that you can transfer as knowledge. But in a strategy game, you can rarely do that. And what I think is interesting, and what you mentioned here, is if we think of a game like Portal. So Portal is just actually one single puzzle, the end puzzle, and everything else is the tutorial to that end puzzle. And I think when we build strategy games, to have that element with us, like, we don't have to make it linear. Of course, it can be like a guiding hand, that guides the player through it. But we can build incredibly enticing and engaging elements where you can have solve the same type of problem in multiple with multiple type of tools. And I think, Seth, you were also mentioning this in terms of the tutorial building and how we can build this when we're talking about the tutorial design.
Yeah, we covered a lot of that in our last podcast on specifically on onboarding. But there, going back to the FPS thing, we're not born with the knowledge of WASD. Somewhere you have to teach the player about that. We don't do that. So now in an FPS, it's a non-issue. But when you're dealing with a strategy game and you're dealing with trying to open it up to a more wide audience, somewhere you have to teach the basic convention. I mean, I was lucky. I got to learn board games when I was 13. So those conventions transferred over to the games of the 80s and the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I was prepared for that. But reaching out and trying to get mass appeal for a game is different than presenting it for the ground guards, so to speak.
Big time.
Yep.
I think what you're saying there's something important to kind of have a brief statement about onboarding is that some genres are so ubiquitous that they don't need the same kind of onboarding because everybody theoretically already knows, and or the developers who are making the game, they don't need to kind of capture new audiences. That is almost certainly not the case for many strategy games, right? Strategy games are rolling in on against a small audience and would love to get new people involved.
And, as a quick time check, we are about an hour and 22 into the actual roundtable. How is time for everybody?
15 to 20 minutes would be good for me.
Okay. So, in that case, for the audience watching us, I'm going to be issuing probably a last call for questions now, then, because I'm sure any topic we'll talk about will be a good 10 to 15 minutes easily. So, if anyone has any final questions for the roundtable, please get it in now. And I won't go to a question that gamedev Talks brought up earlier. They want to know, would like your input about how games like Thief make their AI believable by having AI talking randomly everyday stuff to themselves while having not too much of a complex patterns or logic under the hood. I think this is another aspect of this idea of humanizing AI. That a good writer can certainly add a lot of personality. We can see this in games like a lot of horror games where it's not just AI walking around. They'll mutter to themselves. They'll talk about what's going on. What was it? I know there's been several stealth games where if you throw a can, the AI goes, "What's that?" And then even after you throw the can, they may still be on guard. They may kind of react further to the fact that they know that there's somebody nearby.
Yeah, I think. I think this is called sort of the to map the consumer touch points. So you look at where does the user get in contact with the AI, and how can we enhance those touch points? Because that makes the illusion of the AI being relevant in the long run also believable. Was that also what? Yeah.
Yeah, Gellert, I just want to say you were kind of breaking up a little bit, at least on my side.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, there.
Is it
you
better
stop
now?
breaking up that a second later. You stop breaking.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So what I was mentioning, maybe I can say it again. It's about mapping the consumer touch points. So where you touch the user and when it comes into contact with the AI. So you want to have that to be robust because it keeps the illusion relevant in the long run for the player. The fact of that the AI is acting. So you look at carefully, mapping out where does the user come in contact with the AI, and how can we enhance that interaction? And it doesn't need to be a big thing, like you mentioned. It can be a really tiny thing, just someone looking up, or someone turning, or it can be in a strategy game. It can be someone, sending you a diplomatic request, or it can be someone turning down your request because of the fact that they don't like what you've done previously. So those types of elements. But in the design cycle, it's important to map out those touch points, that when you do this, it should there should be a reaction, because a human would react if you did that.
In the terms of a diplomatic message coming through, I mean, the only thing I think about the Paradox games, and it's a very percentage-driven response. I don't know, is there really an AI acting at that point? You're just rolling a die.
Yeah, I think it's simply just logical branching for the most part.
Yeah. And
I know that there was a funny thing about that, which there was an old bug in the AI. Well, previously the AI was written in Lua, and since much of the AI was copied from Europa Universalis to Hearts of Iron, there was this bug in it where in Europa Universalis they wanted the AI to always look at Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire to protect the Byzantine Empire. And that got transferred into Hearts of Iron. So what ended up happening was that the AI would move its troops sometimes towards the Byzantine Empire. And that meant switching the entire borders of where the AI would guard the borders, right? And it is hilarious to watch that. But at the same time, it kind of, some people thought it kind of made sense, Oh, you have these troops here, and sometimes you want to rotate your forces, and that the AI was doing that to rotate its forces. Sorry to disappoint, it was doing that because the Byzantine Empire.
That reminds me of the infamous the other Alien game that came out, the one by Gearbox, that the AI was broken for years, and the alien would ignore the player, do nothing, and then somebody found years later, because somebody forgot to put a period in the code, and so you put that period in. Now the AI is super reactive to kill you.
Wasn't it the one that Jim Sterling railed against?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question from Thorn in chat, and this is definitely one for the panelists here, definitely not for me. Are there any interesting new tools that are on the horizon / came out recently for AI development?
Well, for board game development, the Keldon AI is a very, very strong method of doing it, and expanding on that. That's what Theresa does, and what Temple Gates is working on. There's some stuff with Digidice, where they were also using a derivative neural network for viticulture. Am I pronouncing that right? Viticulture?
I think there might be no end.
Okay, yeah, viticulture. And, we're starting to see some machine learning coming into game design. But it's very expensive to implement. And only the large publishers are able to build these machine learning systems to handle things, and it's almost at that point still a heuristic. So if it's going to wind up being heuristic, because we can't get an AlphaGo system in a strategy game today. If a machine learning system is going to wind up being heuristic in the way that it kind of works, why not just build a heuristic, which is a lot cheaper?
Though I feel like there's going to be an intermediate state where a game basically uploads all player playthroughs to a central location, then they do the hard processing there, and then they update the AI in response to that. That's going to be something that happens. I think one of the biggest problems with the development of neural networks in some of these games is that the games weren't designed with the limitations of the neural networks in mind. And so a lot of them just have too many variables. Like Paradox games, they're not going to work. They're too complicated. And they're too complicated because they're feeding the complexity desires of the users, and they're not trying to add up the exponent of the math formula that results in the amount of processing to actually make any sense of it.
And also what drives many of these elements. If you look at what's been coming to the mobile games, you on your phone, you're not going to do that type of computation on your phone. So you want to have the back end be done somewhere else than on your phone, because it's just not going to be feasible to do that type of a complex calculations on your phone, or like it will run out of battery the first thing it does, or it would just stand still for 2 minutes computing moves, and people wouldn't like that in their strategy game, of course.
Yeah,
that's something that impressed me about the Templegate stuff. Roll Race for the Galaxy Dominion. They're using, like I said, the Keldon Jones AI, but they're doing it on mobile as well, and it runs pretty slick on mobile. But they're not analyzing the saves or anything like that. I keep begging them to do that. Someone in chat, Axioms, brought up that Brad Wardell of Stardock wanted to analyze the player save games. And as far as I know, he's currently doing that on the beta for Galciv 4. But Brad is also one of the people that has stated that 80% of the players never took Galciv 2 or 3 off of easy. And while he's a good AI programmer, he's questioning the cost versus the return of even bothering with a good AI.
Yeah, and
I think there's a real interesting conversation to be had wrapped around that idea, right? Is that, yes, increasing the overall difficulty of the AI may not produce many positive results in their current user base, but taking the current range of difficulty and more clearly dividing it up into pieces, almost certainly that'll produce good results, because it allows players then to step through their easy mode with more clarity and understanding.
Yeah. And
that is such a great perspective, yeah.
And don't we hit on the innovator's dilemma at that point, where why is a company going to invest in all this research when someone else is going to come in behind them and go, oh, we're just going to take what you've done and leapfrog it?
Well, that doesn't stop him from being the person to do that leapfrogging.
That's true, but someone's got to start.
And it's always, and besides, as the game developer knows, it's always cheapest to be first, because that pretty much makes PR for you by default, right?
Slay the Spire right there.
Totally.
Yep, and the cost was just what I was going to bring up. That, like we said, like on our last roundtable, or the last strategy one, that for a lot of indie developers, especially those on the smaller side, they certainly don't have the budgets to be looking into creating, neural network AIs who can, plan for every single possible solution. I know, John Schaefer, that's it. When he was working on At the Gates, that was sadly one of his major limitations. Like, the design of the game I thought was really well done, but he always struggled with creating an AI that was competent enough that could play that game. And it is, I think, for a lot of smaller, just indie developers in general, like that one white whale that they just can't do. Because if you want to try to build an AI that can, match you pound for pound in a game like Stellaris or Europa Universalis, how many people are going to have the budget and the resources to be able to do that?
I think you have to make a different game at that point, too, because after I've spent 100 hours figuring out the complexities of their system, that's the very beginning at which I can start measuring the AI. So all of the players that stop before that point, they never even look at it, or they can't perceive it, at least. These complicated games have reached an interesting place because they're not serving a sort of like logical strategy experience. They're serving a consumption of complexity experience, right? And so the idea of an AI that can play it well is a little bit at odds with the plate of food they're serving.
And
that's a very interesting element, because you can solve some of that with modding. You can introduce Lua modding, which used to exist. For example, Hearts of Iron 3 had AI modding. You could mod the AI. But when you look at how many people actually did that, it was vanishingly small, because, of course, you have to first know all the in and outs of the game. Then you have to learn the modding language in of itself. Then you have to know Lua. Then you have to combine all of that together in order to make that happen. Right? So So what you say is such an important element, because potentially you could say that modding could be a way of solving some of these issues, open that up for players. But then it's so important in the onboarding that modding element is sort of part of the game. You know, if you think Mario Maker, you can make your own stages and you build them with standardized components, and you can then build all of these elements. It would be fantastic to build a strategy game that way, you know?
That would be fascinating. Like, one of my early like game design like concepts I did a design doc for was, this was back in like 2002 2003. It was basically like Mario Maker for PC. I call it the platformer construction kit, and I kind of envisioned that you could do something like that for other genres. Again, we see something like with RPG Maker for obviously RPG games, but that would be fascinating. Again, I think that like this topic is definitely way too big to get into now. But the idea of having tools that rely less on the programming side, so that again, like with Mario Maker, you don't need to be a programmer to create whatever the heck you want in Mario Maker. But there's also, like, for people who follow Kaizo creators, there's a Lunar Magic, which is kind of like Mario Maker on steroids, that a lot of them use to create a lot of their Kaizo hacks.
Back in the 80s, there was Danny Bunton did a pinball construction set for EA.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God, I love that game.
Danny Bunton,
one of the
best developers out there at the time, creator of Mule.
Ooh.
Anyway, Wilderness.
Thanks for plugging that. Actually, maybe we can give a shout out in the chat as well for people to look up that game. It was a gem of my childhood. I think perhaps also of yours. Yeah.
Indeed.
And as another way to date us, and we remember Click and Play from the 90s. And like Max is giving you like this manual that was like this big to teach you everything about game design.
Oh yeah. Wilderness does an interesting thing. They have a full editor in their game, and you can pretty much mod it to your heart's content. You can make custom campaigns. You can make custom comics. No one does it. It's too complex. It's too difficult. People wind up making new character classes. They wind up making hair sets. They don't dive into it to make custom campaigns. So the modding community is always going to be much smaller. But, you know, in Hearts of Iron 3, we saw some tremendous stuff coming out of the modding community that translated to Hearts of Iron 4. In Civ 4, they released the DLL source code. And some of those people that modded the AI and built the mods now work for Mohawk Games on Old World. So,
and don't forget with XCOM, the Long War mod that was created, and the developer went on to do the Long War mod for XCOM 2, and now they're working on their own game. I talked to him like a few years ago. I need to get him back on. But yeah,
talk to on the Discord.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely don't put the blame on the modders. It's actually the blame is on us as developers, because we've been so busy with giving modders the tools to build content, not context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where we need to make those, and that's why these games we talk about, like Mario Maker, they give you the ability to build context, and that's what we need to introduce also in strategy games. I feel if any element, sort of to summarize the discussion here, the best way to build an AI is to allow people to build context.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I mean, as another quick shout out, the entire like Doom community, like there are modders who have made like completely like radically different games using like the Doom editing tool, and a lot of them like are on Steam now. And I mean, again, like there are very talented people, but like you said, and I think part of the challenge is, how do we get somebody who has a really cool idea for a Doom level or a really cool Mario level, but has no idea about programming and coding and that, how do we get them tools that they can then mess around with?
You know,
or the Half-Life mods, right?
Mhm.
That have nothing to do with shooting or anything. That have like Portal came out of Half-Life, if you think about it, right? And it's
Mhm.
puzzle solver from a shooting game.
well, it gets me to think a little bit about Zachtronics games, who
Oh,
are
yes.
at their
Yes.
very core kind of very effectively training sort of programming thought processes. And you play those games enough hours, and I'm sure you're a lot better at using mod tools.
Zach, like, has his program that you can get his games for schools. Like, I
Yeah.
figure, like, if you can beat like a Zachtronics game, it should just give you a job as a programmer.
Totally.
I
still-
like diploma you can attach
Yeah.
to your CV. Yeah.
Yeah, like
And those
that.
games I think are really important because there's not a lot of people that do that. You know, not a lot of other developers are in up that far up in that space.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wanted to take the concept of the mechanical Turk and apply it to gaming.
And I love talking with Zach. I've spoken to him many times throughout the years. He's always a great guy to talk about or talk with when it comes to
You
stuff
gotta
like
get
this.
me on a stream with him at some point, Josh. It just is a favor to me.
All right.
Yeah,
That would be awesome.
But I think we are coming up on 6 p.m. I know, Tomo, you have to get going in a few minutes, so I believe it is time to wrap things up. And again, we can certainly do more, or we'll certainly have more roundtables in the future. For those of you watching, if you have any suggestions for topics, again, for this roundtable, this is about strategy, game design, and stuff like that. But any topics at all that you'd like us to cover for future ones, please feel free to leave comments. And we will do our round the room kind of shouts for ourselves. So since I'm the host, I'll go last this time. So I will start with Tomo.
What I think is really cool about today's stream is that talking about trying to make AIs more human is actually a really great analogy just for building content for other humans. Us humans trying to build content for other humans, right? There's something really deeply sort of trying to understand human nature and systematizing it so that other people can jump into what you build and have a good time. That's sort of universal in all this. What's funny is I don't know if you actually said it. These are closing comments, right?
Yeah, closing comments, and then we'll do social wrap up.
Right. Cool. And so I think I wasn't really seeing that when we started the stream, but over the course of the stream, kind of coming to that realization was very cool.
Okay, down to Seth.
Kind of the following up on that, kind of like trying to design a game or a fantasy game or an MMO that hits all the Bartle subtype or Bartle subtypes, I guess.
Yeah. Player types, sir.
Player types. In strategy gaming, I think that's a good thing as well. You know, the person who wants to beat up the AI can play on this level. The person that wants the push-pull aspect can do this. And I think it's possible to at least simulate some. You know, like I started with, no one wants to play a grandmaster in chess. You don't do it anymore. In the 80s, when the little chess computers first came out, you know, oh, sure, you did that. But now no one wants to. So you have these multiple ways of getting into the game that are different than just the difficulty levels where they get bonuses.
Seth, we should have a topic discussion that is rewriting the Bartle taxonomy on a per genre basis.
Certainly. Now, there are certain genres that I would be horrible at doing that, and we should bring Josh into some of those.
All right, and Gellert.
I think I'm gonna finish with what I started, and Kasparov, that game with Kasparov and the IBM computer, and how that classic trap sort of ended up by a move that was not essentially taken by the AI. This flawed element that led Kasparov to think that this AI was actually subhuman. It was a super a superpower, a god. He even said IBM cheated because it was an alien. It was thinking like an alien. And in that, I think what came out of this discussion as well is how important that element is to unite that flawed element in our human thinking, but that drives our evolution with that of the machine. Because it prompted Kasparov to resign when the moves were making later on. And I think in that element, for us, there is great hope in this. We can design great AI systems, but it isn't just about designing great AI systems. It's about designing great AI and human systems at the same time. So for us as game developers, the task is let's build those tools to build context. And I think that was sort of, for me, the summarization of what was said. And really, thank you so much for this discussion. I think also perhaps in the future, maybe we can create such an element. Mario Maker for strategy games, you know?
Well, I like the sound of that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
War game construction kit.
There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good summation for this discussion about context, not content. And again, that, like we said, if you wanted to design the perfect AI, it would be, I guess, quote unquote, easy to do. To create the AI who knows how to build or do everything 100% perfectly. But as we've said, people want to have those experience. They want to experience the game. They don't want to just deal with a mechanical plan, 100, that does the same thing 100 times every time the same way. And it would be fascinating to see like games like we were talking about earlier, like action games or just like any game that has an AI, and being able to build one that it's reacting to the player or may quote unquote react in terms of the context of what's happening. And I think that would certainly be a way to go forward in terms of having more interesting designs and get away from either the AI being completely worthless or a grandmaster and be somewhere in between. But I think with that point, I think that will be a good stopping for our discussion. It has been a pleasure hanging out with everybody. So we'll do one more go around. So if you have any places to plug, sites, projects, whatever, go right ahead. And to mix things up, we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with Gellert.
Yeah. Hey guys, if you want to check out the Cold War project, we made a game. You can find my project Terminal Conflict on Steam. Just search Terminal Conflict and you will find it there. I also mentioned today Gary Kasparov's game. You can find that. Just Google the game between Gary Kasparov and IBM. And I would really, if you're interested in mathematics and programming, check out AlphaZero Go and the stuff that they have published. It is going to open worlds for you. And should you need to contact me or anything like that, you will find all of the data. Just write me on Discord or anywhere else with questions or requests. I'm always available. And thank you for the panel, and thank you Josh and Tomo and Seth. Absolutely brilliant.
All right. Over to Seth.
Hey, like I said before, I'm Seth. You can find me down below. I've got, Josh has all my links posted. If you want to catch any of us, you can go to my Discord, and we're all there, and we'd love to have you. Chris is even in there from the chat. So, come on over. You can find some of my writing with Terminal Conflict on the Dev Diaries. I do the PR. And I've also got my own project where I talk about strategy games and try to tell people about what's out there, because Steam does a horrible job with discovery.
All right, and to Tomo?
Yeah, Steam definitely does a terrible job of discovery. Every time I have weird search criteria, I always find something interesting and new. So you can find, we stream development a few times a week, and we have dev chat sessions centered around our Discord channel and our Twitch channel. Both the Discord channel is Epic Tavern .gg, discord.gg/Epic Tavern, and the Twitch channel is twitch.tv/Epic Tavern. And of course, we're available on Steam Early Access if you look for Epic Tavern on Steam.
All right, and for me, you'll find all my links and such over, I got pointed the right way, on the right-hand side of the overlay there. I am on Twitter. We have the Game Wisdom Discord. That is a link down below. We have our Patreon as well. If you'd like to support the channel, I would greatly appreciate it. And be sure to check out game-wisdom.com for my writings and general talks. Obviously, subscribe here if you like game design talks and interviews and more. I have my books, the 20 Essential Games to Study and the Game Design Deep Dive series. And I've already been in talks with my publisher about 4 more books. So looking forward to writing about deck builders and RPGs, and I've already forgotten what the other books are going to be on. There's just so much. But there'll be links to everything, so be sure to check that out. And again, we'll be doing these roundtables. We're going to shoot for doing them once a month. We still have our main one to probably start talking about that in a few weeks. Again, Gellert, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and it was nice meeting you as well.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you guys for inviting me. What an honor. Also, I want to say, hey, Seth, I said I will plug it, but let's all support the great state of Texas where you're at. A lot of more development needs to come out of Texas in terms of game development. I'm working with Seth, as you guys know, and thank you again for inviting me.
All right, and
there's some good content stuff coming down the pipe from both of us. So
right, and to Tomo and Seth again, thank you guys for coming on. We'll be chatting more on the Discord as well as on the next roundtable.
Of course. It was a great time. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for the excellent roundtable.
All right, and thank you as well for coming on. So we are going to wrap things up for today. For those of you watching this live, I will be back later tonight for my regular game streams. For everyone else, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Have a great rest of your day, and take care.